Now, while Tony Khan may be celebrating a great pay-per-view this weekend and is in a good mood, it was not a completely great week for AEW because they were served by a lawsuit. Longtime professional wrestling announcer Kevin Kelly, real name Kevin Foote, and the Tate Twins, a.k.a. Dalton Castle's boys, filed a lawsuit against AEW on August 30th before the Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas. The lawsuit was first reported by the Wrestling News, which, for those who don't know, I believe is headed up by Brian Last, who is Jim Cornette's co-host on his podcasts. This was tweeted out by the Wrestling News' account on Twitter. 3 former talents terminated by the company have brought a lawsuit against All Elite Wrestling, among others. The suit, brought by announcer Kevin Kelly and wrestlers Brandon and Brendan Tate, was filed on August 30th in the Philadelphia County, Pennsylvania Court of Common Pleas by attorneys Stephen P. New and Benjamin Baer, and is seeking to void the arbitration clause of their talent contracts. So, for those who don't know, AEW contracts, they call for binding arbitration in the event of a contract breach, rather than the ability to file a lawsuit. So voiding it would then allow the 3 of them to file other suits regarding whatever their respective claims are. But this is the key right here. It continues, as well as requesting the court certify a class action suit against AEW over claims the company is misclassifying its wrestling talent as independent contractors rather than employees. In April, it was reported that the Tate brothers, known professionally as the Boys, were released from their Ring of Honor contracts due to budget cuts. ROH owner Tony Khan claimed during media events that their release was due to no showing several events, a claim that the brothers deny. That claim is now at the center of a defamation allegation against Khan by the brothers. Kelly, who joined AEW in June of 2023 after working as the English-speaking commentator for New Japan Pro Wrestling, was fired from his position as an AEW play-by-play commentator in March after he went public on his social media expressing his frustrations with the company and Ian Riccaboni, who of course is another announcer who works for Ring of Honor. A PW Insider acquired a copy of the 41-page lawsuit. And in this suit, they being the Tate Twins, allege that they are owed money, including royalties and travel reimbursements, and suffered damages in unspecified amounts for the unpaid compensation and suffered indirect damages in an amount to be determined at trial. That is what they are all claiming here. Now, Stephen P. New, the attorney, has a comment here saying that I applaud the bravery of these plaintiffs in bringing this long overdue action, challenging the misclassification of pro wrestlers as independent contractors instead of employees. We know we are in for a long, hard fight, but in the end, I believe justice always prevails. The lawsuit specifically notes that Tony Khan's statement is demonstrably unproven and false. In fact, plaintiff Tate's, that being the brothers, were prevented from attending one event because AEW incorrectly booked them to fly out of Nashville, Tennessee, instead of their home airport in Knoxville, Tennessee, and AEW failed to correct the travel arrangements when contacted. Defendant Khan did not correct the false statement after receiving this information. The Tates were also not able to do a show in Canada as they were contacted too late to be able to travel to Canada in time for the show. In the lawsuit, the Tates stated that they have not had one wrestling booking since departing Ring of Honor, despite their attempts to work, and that the statement that plaintiffs' Tates were no-shows, which implied that they were unreliable in their profession, subjects each of them to ridicule, embarrassment, humiliation, and detrimental to each of their personal and professional relationships. They stated that Khan had absolutely no evidence to support that plaintiffs' Tates intentionally did not show up for events as opposed to having a legitimate reason for their non-appearance. In the case of Kevin Kelly, ROH announcer Ian Riccaboni is also named a defendant. The lawsuit alleges that he was hired after Tony Khan brought up the idea of Kelly calling AEW Collision during conversations about New Japan Pro Wrestling where Kelly was working at the time. New Japan is a partner with AEW. Kelly's contract contained a termination date of June 30th, 2026, according to the lawsuit, but when he was let go by the company, AEW allegedly breached their deal by not paying him money owed, royalties, and reimbursement of travel expenses. The exact amounts were redacted in the lawsuit. Kelly is alleging defamation and false light on the part of AEW and Riccaboni. In the lawsuit, it states that Kelly used social media to recommend that people view the movies Sound of Freedom on July 12, 2023. This led to Riccaboni allegedly stating on a Discord social media platform on August 13th about him, saying, also had no idea he was going to promote QAnon movies, or else I might have made a different suggestion. I suppose that his name was always in the mix, but that QAnon stuff breaks my heart a little bit. Noting that the film has been associated with QAnon in social media, and that QAnon has been described as a right-wing conspiracy group that spreads misinformation and disinformation, the lawsuit notes that Kelly attempted to contact defendant Riccaboni in an attempt to resolve the false statement published by him regarding plaintiff's implied association with QAnon and received no response. Stating that Kelly does not have, has never had, and will never have an association with QAnon, the lawsuit alleges that the implied association with QAnon subjected plaintiff Kelly to ridicule, embarrassment, humiliation, and is detrimental to his personal and professional relationship. By the way, when I say Kelly, I'm just replacing Foot. Foot's his real last name. If I say Kelly, I'm just using them interchangeably. The lawsuit states that Riccaboni published the statements on Discord, publishing it with knowledge of in reckless disregard for their falsity, and had absolutely no evidence to support a relationship between plaintiff Kelly and QAnon, and no evidence to support a relationship between the movies and QAnon. It also stated that the statements are highly offensive to a reasonable person, as it has been reported that QAnon has been defined as a domestic terrorist and/or is otherwise regarding, I don't know why these things are misspelled. What a terrible lawsuit. Regarded as a cult, conspiracy theorists, and antagonistic to the enforcement of laws. The lawsuit notes that Kelly made a complaint to AEW about Riccaboni's post, pointing out that AEW's social media policy, which is redacted in the public, or to the public in the lawsuit, but that after the complaint, AEW began taking adverse actions towards Kelly's announcing duties, including Tony Schiavone began doing play-by-play on Collision in November of 2023, taking over Kelly's role. AEW told Kelly that Riccaboni had been disciplined. He would not tell Kelly what that discipline was, and that Kelly was never told the outcome of the complaint. The lawsuit notes that to date, Kelly still does not know. The lawsuit alleges that the stress from defendant Riccaboni's unwarranted comment and AEW's lack of response adversely affected Kelly's mental health and his marital status. Kelly alleges he informed AEW of the stress and mental health consequences that he was experiencing due to the comment and lack of response. After he was not booked for Sting's retirement event in March, Kelly called and left a message for AEW's Human Resources Department regarding his treatment. He was terminated in April. Kelly is also alleging tortious interference with contract or business relationship by Riccaboni, citing that Riccaboni knew that he was providing commentary for AEW Collision, and by posting the statement on social media that was available to the public, Riccaboni intentionally and unjustifiably interfered with the relationship between AEW and the plaintiff. So then it goes on. I'm actually going to cut some of this out here, but it says Kelly also alleged that he had a potential business opportunity to work the May 6th New Japan Pro Wrestling All Together event, providing English commentary, but believes, based upon information and belief, defendant AEW prevented plaintiff Kelly from being hired to do English commentary. Kelly is alleging that he suffered damages in at least the amount of, and it's redacted by the court, and will continue to suffer damages from any future wrongful actions by defendant AEW that interfere with plaintiff Kelly's business opportunities or business relationship. So that's a lot to digest, and I'm not going to get into, there's a whole list here of what they're seeking. It does say plaintiffs have requested a jury trial and have also filed a motion to file under seal, likely for material in their contracts that would not normally fall under public consumption. The amount of damage they're seeking has been redacted in the filing, and AEW and Ian Riccaboni have not yet responded to the lawsuit. I'm not even sure they've been served yet, but there is a case management hearing that has been set for November 15th. Now, as this was breaking, I guess Conrad Thompson was sitting and recording with Jim Ross for JR's podcast. So he brought this up to Jim Ross, as somebody who has worked in talent relations before and would know from contracts and contract language. I guess he wanted to get JR's perspective to the extent that JR could talk about this, because obviously JR is an employee of AEW. And so you're not going to necessarily get his full-throated, honest opinion necessarily, or dive too deep into what he thinks. But he did bring it up and said, do you have any thoughts on this? And this is what Jim Ross had to say. He said, when you sign your contract, you agree to the terms, and that would include being an independent contractor. The plaintiffs will run out of money before Tony Khan does. I don't hold out much hope that they're going to get any kind of settlement whatsoever, but maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a judge or a lawyer or anything along those lines. I don't like those kinds of lawsuits. I think they are frivolous. You would think that guys could get together and could work out something before going to spending their money on a lawyer who's probably doing it on an if you win, you get this. If you don't win, no harm, no foul. Well, there is harm. There is foul. But you knew what you were doing when you signed your deal. Well, Stephen P. New heard this, and he was on the House of Kayfabe podcast, and he decided to respond to JR's comments, and this is what the attorney had to say. JR, Jim Ross, called this a frivolous lawsuit. Well, let me tell you something. This is not a frivolous lawsuit. You are part of the problem. You, Jim Ross, are part of the problem because you fed the guys in WWE as talent relations these crap contracts for a quarter of a century. You told these guys that it was a take it or leave it deal and they needed to sign these crap contracts that were contracts of adhesion that they should have never signed in the first place. I'm not shocked in the least that you go on Conrad Thompson's podcast and say this is a frivolous lawsuit. I might lose, but by God, it's not frivolous. Tony Khan has paid Jim Ross a lot of money to do nothing for about 5 years now. So if I were Jim Ross and I were living at Jacksonville Beach and making a bunch of money to do not much at all, I would probably come out and call Stephen P. New's lawsuit frivolous too. Everybody's got a price. Which is quite the statement for him to make about Jim Ross. Tony Khan saw this, and he responded on Twitter on Saturday, writing, I've just read Stephen P. New's comments about Jim Ross. I am shocked and appalled by these comments on legend Jim Ross, part of AEW's foundation, someone so important from the beginning of AEW and still right now today. AEW, JR, and I reserve all rights. Look, I have addressed the employee versus independent contractor farce on this show before many, many times. Over all the years I've done this podcast, this comes up every now and then. I interviewed Bob Holly many years ago. He worked for years and years and years in WWE. And I said, you know what? I'm going to ask him about this. And I brought it up to him, and he agreed that it's a farce. He even brought up the old dress code that they used to have, telling talent what to wear and what not to wear. There was a study that was published that used what the IRS calls its 20-factor test to determine whether or not somebody meets the criteria for employment status. This was years ago. This is nothing new. But they have this test, and this is before AEW was even formed. And they found the WWE met 16 of the 20 different points for its talent to be considered employees. I would imagine that if they ran that same test today with AEW, they would meet most of the same criteria. It is crazy that they can classify them as independent contractors, and yet they wield so much influence and so much control over their lives. They're not even allowed, like in WWE, they're not even allowed to seek outside endorsements of their own, not without prior approval, or seek outside gigs like movie roles, again, without prior approval, which that I can understand to the extent of, okay, we need to make sure it doesn't interfere with anything you're doing on TV. If you're going to go off and film a movie or a TV show or a commercial, what's that going to look like schedule-wise, right? We need you on the road. We need you at our shows. But historically, we've heard stories. Not only would they just reject these things outright, but there were stories from years ago about, movie studios that had a wrestler in mind for a role. And then Vince McMahon and the management in WWE would say, oh, no, you know what? We have somebody else who would be great in that role. And they would give it to John Cena. Or they would recommend John Cena. Or they would recommend some other big name because they were trying to get their big names over. So if somebody were to approach WWE and say, hey, we got a great part for that Sheamus guy. Let's say early in Sheamus's run before he was a bigger star. They could turn around and go, oh, you know what? You don't want him. We got this guy, Randy Orton. He'd be great for that part. Like, this shit would happen a lot. So imagine if you're that wrestler, how frustrating it would be. But it was happening even as recently as just a few years ago. Damian Priest was just on with Chris Van Vliet. He did this great interview with Chris. And in this interview, he talked about how he almost got a role in the Black Panther sequel, but it got taken away from him. He says he was cast in Black Panther Wakanda Forever 2 years ago. The belief is that he was cast for the role of Atuma, but he had the opportunity taken away from him. And he didn't explicitly say that WWE stopped him from appearing in the movie. He made it very clear that Marvel was not the party responsible for taking the role away from him. He said, basically, it got taken away from me, but not from Marvel. And he confirmed that he was offered the role. It wasn't that he was considered. He says he was offered the role. And Chris said, well, I think we can read between the lines here that, the old regime in WWE was a little bit different at that time. And, I kind of see what you're saying here. And Priest was like, yeah, exactly. So imagine how frustrated that must have been for him. Now, things worked out well for him because he ended up becoming World Heavyweight Champion. He had this run with the Judgment Day. He made all these new friends because they're very tight. Who knows if any of that happens? 2 years ago, if he gets that role and it takes him away from wrestling or it leads to another role, right? He doesn't have the spot that he has now. He even said that in the interview. Like, in the end, it all worked out, but I can imagine at the time he was fucking frustrated. You have the potential to have a part in a Marvel movie. Look what it did for Batista. He got cast in Guardians of the Galaxy. He came back to WWE. He wanted them. He talked to Triple H and Stephanie. He wanted them to promote it. And they laughed in his fucking face because they didn't know from it. They thought, oh, yeah, whatever. It's not going to be a big deal. How many millions or billions of dollars did that movie end up making? It led to even more Guardians films. And it blew up his career in the best way possible. You never know. I mean, these superhero movies, historically, they make money hand over fist, to say nothing of their quality. That would have been a big spot for him. But this kind of shit would happen all the time. How does something like that happen if you're an independent contractor? You have a role presented to you, could be a life-changing opportunity, and your boss, your company that you work for here says, no. Really? Independent my ass. Ultimately, it's up to the talent in these companies to band together to fight for the change in classification if collectively they feel that they would be better off for it. Evidently, not enough of them do. In WWE and AEW right now, they get paid very well in most cases. They get paid well enough to keep their mouth shut. With AEW, Tony Khan does allow talent to work for outside companies. He does allow them to book their own independent gigs. That's something WWE does not allow, although they are starting to allow, certain wrestlers to appear on certain shows, Bloodsport. They have this working agreement with TNA. That's all through WWE, though. They still maintain control over that. They still have to say yes or no. But the exclusivity issue, that's only one small part of this. Just because AEW lets guys book some indie shots does not mean that they should not be classified as employees. AEW still wields a lot of control when it comes to that, and who can win and who can lose and stuff like that. It's not like you're free to just go out and book yourself and do whatever the hell you want. It is still a bullshit classification regardless of which national promotion you work for. But this is something that can not only affect AEW, but it would affect WWE. It would affect the business at large. So this is something to watch for, not because I actually expect a change in classification, but because this is probably going to end up getting settled. I know Jim Ross says he doesn't think so. I think so. I think this ends in a settlement to make this go away quietly. Both companies stand to lose too much if this doesn't go their way, if this goes to trial. It's like Jim Ross said, Tony Khan has a lot more money than they do. He could always drag this out and bleed them dry until they drop it. But believe me, they don't want this to go to court. They don't want this to go to discovery. Remember the class action suit from the stockholders against WWE? They claimed they were misled over their business dealings with Saudi Arabia. WWE chose to settle for almost $40 million rather than drag that fight out. Look at the MLW lawsuit. Court Bauer got a $20 million payday out of WWE rather than see that antitrust lawsuit go to discovery, because that would not have made WWE look very good. This is not something either company wants to see play out. So this too, I suspect, will end up being settled, and they will go quietly into that good night.